Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, being brought to you by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. We are in Module 4 of our series of lectures on English language and literature. Module 4, as you know, is being devoted to literary criticism, and today we are in lecture 10 of this module. This lecture is entitled Postcolonialism, and in a moment I shall be telling you how this lecture is going to be structured. But before that, let us do, as we always do, a recap of the last lecture. And the last lecture, you will recall, was devoted to the topic post-structuralism. For instance, we saw through Chris Barker in his book, The Sage Handbook of Cultural Studies, wherein he says that the word post as a prefix, okay, obviously suggests after, okay, and therefore post-structuralism in a sense is obviously after the school of criticism, or even philosophy as we may put it, known as structuralism, right. But the important point that we found in the last lecture, as is being argued by Chris Barker, is that the post does not mean simply, okay, an after in the temporal sense. This after is a little complicated in that, if you look at these words here, this involves both the absorption, okay, of key ideas from structuralism and also a critique and transformation of them. So, what do we find here? That post-structuralism is both a continuation and a critique, okay, of the structuralist enterprise. Next, we found that whereas in structuralism, meaning as given to us by Saussure is understood through a system of difference, hence meaning is known as being differential, and through a system of relations, okay, among the various units of a system. We found that language in structuralism is a self-sufficient system wherein meaning emanates, okay, through a system of difference and relation among the units of that system, right. Then we also found in structuralism, which is going to be radically critiqued by post-structuralism, we found in structuralism that meaning comes about through the organization of science, and you remember this was an important word in structuralism, and the stability of meaning, okay, is achieved through the structures of this organization. Okay, so it was a neat way of understanding, almost a formulaic, if we may say, a way of understanding meaning emanation in language. Okay. Then we found that post-structuralism followed or critiqued structuralism in that it saw the production of meaning through science as endlessly deferred. So, we found, for instance, through Derrida that meaning was not only differential, but meaning was also deferred, or meaning was also postponed, right. So, no text had a complete meaning in itself or the authoritative meaning, because by the very nature of the science system. Now, the post-structuralists we saw did not, did not say that there was no structure. Their job was to show us the structurality of the structure itself, okay, that the structure is there, right. But if you look at it closely, you can dismantle that structure, because the sign, there are no pure signifieds, that is, no signifier, okay, which is a part of the sign. No signifier has a or an authoritative signified. Okay. There may be many nuances to a sign, and meaning precisely because, this is turning the structuralist claim on its head, right. This is precisely because meaning comes about by a system of difference. That system of relation and difference is a fluid one. Okay, this is what we had seen, and then as we see in this slide, we found the word difference given to us by Derrida, that is, which is a combination of to differ and to differ. Okay. Then an important point that we found through, say, philosophers like Michel Foucault was that the subject, okay, the one who experiences, right, is actually an effect of discourse, and this is a word we shall be coming across again in today's lecture, and we found that the subject is really an effect of language according to the structuralist claim, and language and practice, right, discourse and practice cannot be separated, right. Our practices are also an effect of language. This is something that we had discussed in the last lecture. I didn't go into it again. And we found that discourse is really, or language is really, you know, the power, we can term it after Michel Foucault as the power to name, right. Discourse has the ability to create a subject, to create its subjectivity, to create its identity, you know, indeed to create its most personal or even private of feelings, right. These are all understood as the effect of discourse. Okay. For instance, if man is understood through the discourse of religion, man is, you know, the effect, the subjectivity of man is understood to be an effect of the larger discourse of the religious kind, right. Therefore, we found that this is a term which almost, you know, this term here is a linking term that links us to postcolonialism. We found that this is anti-essentialist. Now, if you recall from previous lectures, what is essentialism? Essentialism means that there are essences to things, okay, that things have essences in themselves. Okay, there is something ontologically, philosophically speaking, there is something ontologically true of things, right. But post-structuralism, in denying a determinate meaning, in denying an authoritative meaning or the meaning of things, okay, becomes anti-essentialist, right. So, things, texts are amenable to several meanings. Now, again, as I said in the last lecture, this does not mean that anything goes, okay. It simply means that there may be readings of texts that do not follow or even radically question assumed certain assumptions of patterns of reading, of techniques of reading, bringing out some other relationships in the text which are otherwise, you know, hidden by, you know, what we call the dominant modes of reading or reading practices. Okay. So, this point takes us directly really to the lecture that, you know, or rather the topic of discussion today, that is postcolonialism. Now, I will take the help of a glossary, you know, of literary and cultural terms given to us by Peter Brucker. It is a useful book, you may look it up. It is a glossary of you know, literary theory, terms used in literary theory, and he gives us these three terms, okay, all starting with post, okay, post-structuralism, post-modernism, post-colonialism, and he says that, you know, we have to look at the term post here, as I said a while ago, in terms of changes and departures, not in terms of clear cut from the word without its prefix post. Okay. For instance, post-structuralism is a change and departure from the structuralist mode. Postmodernism is again a change and a departure, but with, you know, obvious linkages to modernism, and postcolonialism is also rendered a problematic term in the sense that the post here is simply not a dividing line between, you know, a colonial past and a post-colonial present. These terms, I need you to understand, are slightly more complicated than simply being a temporal term. Okay? Now, what is common among these three terms according to Peter Brucker? We have we have post-structuralism, postmodernism and postcolonialism. He says that these three schools of thought, okay, among other things, right, obviously this is not an exhaustive list, among other things, they point to difference, a term that we already found in post-structuralism. They point to the most important, one of the most important terms, not simply in literature but also in philosophy, which is meaning, the emanation of meaning or the formation or the construction of meaning, critique, right, critiquing established modes of thinking, okay, and identity. So, difference, meaning, critique and identity are some of the terms or some of the, you could say some of the goals or some of the important constituent terminology in post-colonialism, post-structuralism and post-modernism. Okay, so these are basically the terms that these three ways of thinking grapple with. Another, before we go into post-structuralism proper, another point that I would like to raise here is there are also critics that have drawn or pointed to the the similarities, right, both political and discursive, between say feminism and post-colonialism. Okay. For instance, these are my own words here, which I would like to read out. Scholars have often pointed to the complementarities shared by post-colonialism and feminism, okay, as both discourses, they are at once discourses and they are at once struggles. Okay. So, as both discourses and as the struggles of real men and women, their concerns have hinged largely around the question of human dignity, freedom and the opposing of oppression that ranges from opposing the creation of cultural stereotypes to actual bondage. Okay. So, both feminism, just a while ago we saw the similarities between post-modernism, post-colonialism and post-structuralism. As far as feminism is concerned, okay, it shares, it shares with post-colonialism not just certain discursive terms, okay, but also the more important political, okay, political opposition to dominant genders on the one hand and to dominant races and nations on the other hand. Okay. So, both have human dignity, human freedom and the opposing of oppression, okay, as their ultimate political goals, right. So, as complementary discourses in the general rubric of contemporary literary and cultural studies, the two discourses of feminism and post-colonialism have raised, this is extremely important, epistemological challenges. From the point of view of discourse, okay, there is of course the larger political end to be met, but also from the point of view of discourse, okay, the challenges have been as deep as raising epistemological questions. Okay. So, some of you may have come across the term epistemology. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy. Okay. Epistemology, I do not know if I have mentioned this or will be mentioning this in one of our lectures here, but let me go into this a bit. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy which deals with knowledge. Okay. It is also known as the theory of knowledge, right. So, epistemology raises fundamental questions about knowledge. For instance, beginning with a question like what is knowledge, okay? What are the sources of knowledge? How do we know that a piece of information is knowledge? What is the difference between knowledge and belief, right? When and how does a belief become knowledge, okay? Is it at all possible for us to have complete knowledge? What is truth as far as knowledge is concerned? What is the relationship between knowledge and truth, etc. So, these are, as you will understand, that these are very fundamental questions. So, both feminism and post-colonialism, they challenge the they raise epistemological challenges to hegemonic structures. For instance, feminism would raise epistemological challenges and challenge the knowledge formation, okay, the way knowledge is formed through a patriarchal discourse that favors men. For instance, post-colonialism would launch an epistemological attack on, say, to say very loosely here, really, to a dominant so-called Western way of constructing knowledge, both about itself and the other. Okay. So, let me quickly read this again. The discourses of feminism and post-colonialism have raised epistemological challenges to hegemonic structures, and this is important here, both in academics and in policy making. Do you follow? Okay. So, what we have done till now is we have looked at the similarities between or among post-structuralism, post-modernism, post-colonialism and feminism, and we have used one word, if you recall here, we have used the word anti-essentialist. All these are anti-essentialist discourses, okay, or as we say, should be anti-essentialist discourses. Okay. It should not be that feminism becomes an essentialist discourse in its bid to try and oppose structures that have been there because of patriarchy. More about this, the dangers here towards the end of this lecture, right. What then is the epistemological challenge that is being made by post-colonialism? Let us look at this slide carefully here. Okay. We have this word here, the Orient, that you are aware of these two words, the Occident and the Orient. Okay. The Orient is here referred to the East and the Occident to the West. Okay. So, what are, now let us raise this question, what are the epistemological challenges that are made by post-colonial writers, post-colonial authors, post-colonial critics? Post-colonialism as an enterprise, as a theory, as a discourse and as an academic and political enterprise does this. Okay. It looks at, let us look at this slide here, it looks at, it studies or explores and critiques Western structures, right. Now, in Western structures we may add terms like discourses, and if you remember, discourses are what? Discourses are ways of speaking about something, right. For instance, if you recall, if we look at man as a religious, a point on the discourse of religion, okay, there is a way of talking about man. Okay. There is a way in which we define man, there is a way in which we talk about the purpose of why man is, why man exists in the first place, for instance. And if we talk from, say, the discourse of biology, for instance, okay, then the definitions would change, right. So, post-colonial critics hold that the West, because of imperialism, because of actual annexation, actual rule, domination, for, because of which we had cultural domination too and economic domination, they built certain discourses. Okay, they built certain ways of talking. For instance, when the British were in India, they had certain discourses, certain ideas of the so-called natives, of people in India, and they had a certain way of talking, okay, about the natives, right. So, first the epistemological challenge is to the discourse, right. Where has and how has this knowledge, okay, which has given rise to a way of speaking, has given rise to a terminology, what are its sources, okay, what are its limits, that is, what are the conditions under which such knowledge has emanated in the first place, right. So, there is an attack on the discourse, okay, positing, if we may use a word, a counter discourse to the main hegemonic Western discourse, the discourse that has come from the Occident, particularly through imperialism, right. Now, this is the first level. In the second level, we find that there is an attack or there is a critique of the ideologies that have. Now, what are ideologies? If we say that discourses are ways of speaking, then ideologies, we may say, are ways of seeing. The ways of seeing or particular lenses through which intellectual, moral, right, lenses through which you look at something, anything, any phenomenon, any person, any race, any community, any subject, okay, and you hold, which gives you certain ways of looking at that. So, you will understand that discourse is not separate from ideology, right. Ideology, ways of seeing give you a certain discourse, okay, ways of speaking. Ways of speaking also, on the other hand, feed into your way of looking at something, ways of seeing something, right. So, it is argued that the West right, in postcolonialism, it is argued that the West has created certain discourses, ways of speaking, and ideologies, ways of seeing as far as the East is concerned. Okay. Then after that, culture. What are, how is the culture of the native, okay, that is the colonized country, how is its culture viewed, how is it judged, right, how is and how it shows in the discourses or the ways of speaking and writing about India, for instance, by the Britishers, right. So the study is also, there are also epistemological questions relating to culture, and finally constructs. What are the constructs, okay, what are the images that we have by the colonized nations on the colonizers. Now this is simply because we've just begun to get into to talking about postcolonialism in an elementary sort of way. It is not always the fact that in postcolonialism you study only the colonizers' knowledge or the colonizers' discourse and ideology. Okay, a very important part of it is how the colonized, right, during colonization, okay, have looked at the colonizers. What are the forms of resistance? More about this a while later, okay. But simply because I was talking about epistemology and the challenges to the core structures of knowledge, that is why we have this slide here, and in that way we can say that the discourses, the ideologies, the culture and constructs of the West as far as the East is concerned are what? Are critiqued by the postcolonial critics, right. So definitely, how do we then bring in the term anti-essentialism? If I asked you this mode of looking at Western structures by the postcolonial critics, how is it anti-essentialist? Okay, sort of essentializing of the colonized people was created by the Western structures. To put it very simply, postcolonialism has had, I will talk about that towards the end of this lecture. There are so many, there are many ways in which postcolonialism may also be critiqued, right, in a sort of quite what I feel are certain myopic ways of considering the West. However, we will begin by talking about the main orientation of the postcolonialism. There is therefore a very important binary here, okay. This is what we call the otherization here. This binary is the division between the self and the other. This lies at the core, really, the crux of postcolonial criticism. In one sense, the self is, say, the colonizing nation, the other is the colonized. And from another perspective, when we are talking from the point of view of the colonized becomes the self and the colonizer becomes the other. This elementary binary opposition here between the self and the other is at once the defining crux of postcolonialism, okay, as well as its theoretical limitation, right. To be always seeing and considering the colonizer or the colonized, in whichever perspective we are taking, as the other, right, is to miss out what we find in the interstices of this binary, okay, is to miss out certain other kinds of connections, certain complementarities. More about this later. We first talk about postcolonialism, really, right. Then come to this a while later, right. Now, I said that as with post-structuralism, as with post-colonialism, okay, post-modernism, post-colonialism can also, we cannot really have neat divisions about, say, from this date post-colonialism begins, like we can't have definite division about when post-modernism comes away from postmodernism comes away from modernism. There are many who have said that postmodernism is nothing but and to quote, I forget the name of the theorist. Anyway, to see postmodernism as an incomplete project of modernity, right. So also in postcolonialism, right, you cannot really pair out the colonial and the post-colonial As I said, because there are problems with the binary opposition between self, other and colonizer, colonized. Okay. Another point of view also, the anti-colonialist discourse is something that has seemed to be sort of given a short shrift because of post-colonialism, right. Post-colonialism in a sense, of course, is the culture, the ideology, the discourses after actual decolonization, right, or actually of a colonizing country leaving the colonized country to have its own government, etc., independence for that matter, right, okay, to put it simply. But for instance, if you look at this slide here, there the theoretical political impetus was given not necessarily within, right, post-colonial setup. For instance, you may have heard of Frantz Fanon, okay, who a writer who was deeply involved with the struggle for independence in Algeria, from independence from France. Okay. Fanon gave us some of the most important explorations, particularly from the point of view of psycholinguistics and psychopathies also, right, of what colonialism does to the psyche, to the individual and the collective psyche. Fanon himself was a psychiatrist, okay, who served and and he saw as a doctor, and he saw firsthand the outcome of the colonial encounter, not only not only on what happens to the colonized population in the colonized nations, okay, also what happens to the colonizing forces, what happens to, for instance, for a white soldier, okay, who is in Algeria. You follow? So Fanon here says, to speak means above all to assume a culture, to support the weight of a civilization. Okay. Now this is from his book Black Skin, White Masks, and one of the most fundamental aspects of problems in this colonial, post-colonial setup is that of language. Okay. When a colonizing nation sort of imposes, right, its language on the natives. And Fanon, for instance, says that to speak any language is not just to speak the language or to know the letters and to know the grammar of the language. It also is to assume its culture, its values, its epistemologies, and as he said, excuse me, the weight of a whole civilization. Okay, if you look at language very deeply, you will understand that language is not simply having competence, linguistic competence. It runs far, far more deep. Then when we come to academicians in post-colonialism, right, when you come to literary and cultural criticism in academia, there are several names here, of course, but the most important here or the ones that have been foregrounded in anthologies, in discussions, in books are these three names, okay, Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Homi Bhabha, not the scientist, okay, Homi Bhabha the theorist, and Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. Now if you look at their biography, you find that these are not people from the West. Okay, they have come to the West, joined the academia there, and there was a time when post-colonial criticism, right, was inaugurated, so to speak. Now remember, we have Fanon, we have others like Aimé Césaire, for instance, okay, who talked about anti-colonialism. But when you talk about post-colonialism as being made part of the literary even canon, so to speak, then we talk about writers like Bhabha, Said, and Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. And we will look quickly at these and how they are critiqued and what some of their formulations are, right. Some of the points that they have been collectively looking at, and each of them giving more emphasis on some of these points here, are again similar points that we will find in post-colonial literary criticism and cultural criticism, and these are, for instance, identity, the question of identity in a post-colonial situation, okay, of reappropriation, of cultural and linguistic reappropriation by people in a post-colonial setup, right. Questions of resistance, how literary texts and other cultural objects have resisted. Remember what we had seen a while ago, resisted, we had those 4 terms, the discourses, you know, for instance, the ideologies and the culture, for instance, and the language of the colonizing nation. Okay, so how writers, creative writers have resisted those dominant structures, those dominant epistemes, and brought about a reappropriation of their, of their native cultures, right. Here in this lecture, I am not going to talk about any one critique, or I am not going to discuss the individual contributions of critiques. This is more of a general lecture, so that you can understand overall, in an overall sense, what post-colonialism or the post-colonial enterprise entails. Okay. So there are questions of identity being looked at by these critics of, as I said, resistance and resistance to the other culture, and reappropriation, redeeming, so to speak, or redemption of one's own culture, right. Subaltern is an important term, also as Spivak herself has said, often misunderstood term. Subaltern is a term which has been revived by Gayatri Spivak in her theory, contribution to theories of post-colonialism. Okay, the term subaltern actually comes, is a military term. It comes from the, from a position in, in the forces, in the army. Okay, so one of our very important and also controversial essays is, Can the Subaltern Speak? Okay, the question of agency in the natives, in the colonized people, how far they have a language and a discourse of their own, in broadly speaking. Then another term, hybridity, and this term again is attributed to Homi Bhabha, and this talks about the hybrid condition of the post-colonial, straddle, so to speak, between his or her own culture and that of the colonizing nation, even in a post-colonial setup. Okay, where, for instance, just because you belong to an independent nation, or nation that has become independent after a duration of having been colonized, doesn't mean that from that date of independence that you your orientation, your so to speak, your values, your constructs, your ideologies, that they have been completely snapped. Okay, so an important point to realize is, you may be post-colonial from a temporal or time point of view, but the structures remain. Okay, so much so that there are so many critics who say that the British have, they left India, but handed over the same structures to a middle class bourgeois leadership, okay, without much changes. We also see this in the phenomenon called neo-colonialism, for instance. So according to Bhabha and many other critics, we are really in such situations, the post-colonial is really a hybrid and never really post-colonial, cannot be a post-colonial. Okay. Next, there are also, post-colonial criticism also looks at efforts, or you could say assertions of cultural belonging, right, questions of cultural belonging, not in the sense simply of appropriation, or also, but also, as you will find in many diasporic writers, for instance, cultural belonging becomes a highly problematic term, in the sense that the texts do not show a clear sense of belonging to a culture. Is in particularly in diasporic writers, the problematics of cultural belonging and power. It's not that other writers, critics, not talk about power, but this also is an important contribution by Edward Said. If you recall Foucault, okay, one of the most important terms in the whole critical terminology of Michel Foucault is power. Okay, And Edward Said's works like Orientalism, Culture and Imperialism, okay, obviously show the influence of Michel Foucault. Okay. Power and discourse, these being the two most important theoretical, you could say, pivots that Said had borrowed from Michel Foucault. Okay. So, see, these are really some of the terms that you should talk about in when you are beginning post-colonial studies, and at the same time we have to understand that these terms simply do not mean a uni or one dimensional way of looking. The colonizer, for instance, okay, the colonizer is also a change of subjectivity and identity in the colonizer when he or she comes into contact with the colonized civilization or the colonized culture. It is not that the colonizer in any colonial situation is not that the colonizer just stands back and starts making pronouncements on the colonized. Okay. A post-colonialism that is a sophisticated one has to look at these hidden aspects of subjectivity, of identity, of cultural belonging, for instance, of power. Okay, it's not so many have criticized, and I would say rightly so, works like Edward Said's Orientalism, which was published in 1978, I think. Okay, where he says, now let us look at this slide here. In that book, he says, talks about Orientalism as a systematic discourse by which Europe was able to manage, look at this, manage and even produce the Orient. Look at this. Said says that the Orient, the East, was systematically produced, okay, constructed, okay, managed, given direction to where discourses were created, okay, by Europe, okay, about the Orient, about the East in so many different ways, politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically and imaginatively. If you look at this even as a standalone quotation, you will find that it is a one directional or one dimensional way of looking. There is no, he is not talking about the Orient too, not simply in a temporarily post-colonial situation, even within the colonialized situation, the Orient too having its own structures about the West. So, this is one of the problems. Nevertheless, Orientalism, his work Orientalism, that said published in 1978, clearly showing the showing inspiration from Michel Foucault as far as discourse and power relations are concerned, was a seminal book. It was a landmark really, from which people took the cue, critics took the cue and started to improvise on it, started to show the multiple directions and dimensions of it, but really without having, I would say, to grant Edward Said this, without a book like Orientalism, you wouldn't probably have had post-colonialism as an academic an academic discourse that had enormous sway, at least during a certain period of time, and in sort of the rarefied realms of academia. Okay, so this was a book that sort of inaugurated it, right? Also, if you look at say if you want to compare, this is the next point that I would like to talk about. When you want to compare post-colonialism, say, to its kindred terms. Okay, for instance, what are its kindred terms? Some of the synonyms really are Commonwealth. We talk about post-colonial literature, some people say or Commonwealth literature or third world literature. Okay. Now, the point that is raised by students is, are these the same? Are these three terms, Commonwealth, third world and post-colonial, the same? From the point of view of time, from the point of a temporal dimension, I would say, we would safely say that post-colonialism is a relatively newer term. Okay, we have been talking about Commonwealth literatures. The discourse of Commonwealth literatures is not, I would say, not so anti-essentialist, not so radical as that of the post-colonialism. Neither is third world, the term third world literature. Okay, post-colonial post-colonial criticism as a discourse has a far larger terminology, right, has had a far or more longer sway, right, and is far, say far more, far more, has sought to be far more powerful, okay, both discursively, academically and politically, than the kindred terms Commonwealth and Third World, right. That is why we have clear terms in postcolonialism, as I said, the subaltern, Orientalism, then postcolonialist discourses, for instance, hybridity, liminality. There are clear cut. This is really a discourse that has grown and has, as I said earlier, has had a longer sway in academics. What I am going to do is now I will quickly read a passage from a book edited by Carol Breckenridge, and you have some very fine-grained and very important relookings into Orientalism, Edward Said's Orientalism, which talked, as I said, about the way the West has been, the Orient has been constructed systematically and managed in many different directions and dimensions by the West. So, this is an important book if you want to move further from Orientalism and look at the critique and improvisations of Orientalism. She says, and I am reading from her first chapter, post implies that which is behind us, right, and the past implies periodization. This is very clear, very simple, right. Post is of course something that is already past, right, is behind us, talking about something that we have left and now we are in a post situation. We can therefore speak of the post-colonial period as a framing device. Okay, this is very important. It is not simply about talking about a past, a colonized past that has gone and being in a post-colonial situation. It is an epistemologically, it is a framing device. That is, you have a different paradigm, if I may use the word. Paradigm is a strong word here. Let us stick to framing device. It is, it is a framing device, as she says, to characterize what the second half of the 20th century, right. The second half of the 20th century may be looked at through the lenses, okay, or the framing device of post-colonialism. The term, again she says, post-colonial, importantly, it displaces the focus on post-war. Okay, so, it is another post here, right. It displaces the focus on post-war as a historical marker. So, there is a, it makes a shift from a framing device which is mostly based on the discourse of war and post-war, okay, replaces it with post-colonial, right, as a historical marker for the last 50 years. Post-war refers of course to the period after the Second World War, and although the war was central to decolonization, etc., it is used to periodize history much less frequently in the ex-colonial world than in the metropolitan worlds of Europe and America. Okay. So, post-war, even if it talks about decolonization, okay, we will talk from a European perspective. Do you understand? Okay. And it is used to periodize history, as she says, much less frequently in the ex-colonial world, right. So, the post-war for in an erstwhile colonized nation, post-war is not a strong, as far as resistance is concerned, as far as writing back is concerned. Okay, I forgot to mention this very important book, The Empire Writes Back. Sorry, The Empire Writes Back. This is a book that is immensely important as Edward Said's Orientalism, for instance. Okay, you may want to look up that text, right. So, the discourse of post-war is of no use when you talk about post-colonialism, and for the ex-colonized nations, right, post-colonialism is a far more politically charged and far more useful and powerful framing device, right. So, then she says to call the second half of the 20th century post-colonial then is to call for a reappraisal, okay, re-understanding, a relook of the way we frame contemporary world history. So, there is a it's a different, again there is a different discourse that needs to be highlighted, as she says, and to re-emphasize the rupture in national and global relations created by the urge to forge independent nation states, right. It brings to our attention the relations between colonialism and nationalism in the politics of culture in both the societies of the ex-colonizers and those of the ex-colonized. Now, there's just one point that I said, because I mentioned earlier that I would be dealing with it, and this is the critique of postcolonialism and postcolonial criticism. And I am reading from Peter van der Veer, who is one of the editors, I think, of the book by Carol Breckenridge that I had mentioned. He says that although we have to admit that this is a forceful vision, postcolonialism, it is also surely, and he is very categorical in this, it is also surely a misleading one. It is itself a product of Orientalism, since it neglects the important ways, it is so important here, you see, ways in which the so-called Orientals not only have shaped their own world, but also the Orientalist views criticized by side. This is what I had mentioned earlier about being in the interstices of the binary between colonizer, colonized, okay, to look at what happens in between, to look at it not simply a side looked at it as a systematic construction, one-sided construction of the Orient. Here Van der Veer is talking about how also to, the need to look at how the Orientals, so-called Orientals, have not only, as he said, shaped their own world, but also the Orientalist views criticized by side. It would be, as he says, a serious mistake to deny agency to the colonized in our effort to show the force of colonial domination. So, unwittingly, postcolonial criticism may sometimes end up kind of undoing itself, in the sense that it establishes and re-establishes the force of colonial discourse and domination, okay, when it sees the West, East being completely created and managed by the West, and would have forgotten, okay, to study the contribution of the Orientals in this, whether it is regarding Orientalism or regarding its own reappraisals and its own attempts at reappropriation. Okay. So, we come to the end of this, and what I am going to do is, now I am going to pose a few questions, and I will give you some hints as to how to answer these. Okay. For instance, if you begin by saying, name three prominent post-colonial critics, okay, with their corresponding or respective important terms that they have contributed to the post-colonialist discourse. Then you would say that these are, among others, Edward Said, and with him the terms Orientalism, right, based on the influence of Foucault, terms like discourse and power. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak and her, among others, her important term, the subaltern. Subaltern, as I said, was not a term constructed by Spivak. It was a term that comes from the military and was used by Antonio Gramsci very productively. Okay. Then Homi Bhabha and his important terms of hybridity, the hybrid condition, okay, the mixed condition, the liminal condition of both the post-colonial and the colonizer and the colonized. Okay. Next, if you are asked a question like, how does post-colonialism give an epistemological challenge, okay, to dominant discourses, then you will say that like postmodernism, like post-structuralism, okay, post-colonialism also makes epistemological attacks, or rather attacks on the epistemology of how the West has created its knowledge, particularly how the West has created the knowledge of its other, which is the East or the Orient. Okay. So, it will talk about what the sources of such knowledge are, what the limits or conditions under which such knowledge has been formed, the uses to which it has been put, the nature of such knowledge. Okay. Then if you get a question like, what are the most important what are the most important terms in post-colonial criticism, in the sense of what are the most important points that come up in discussions of post-colonialism, then you would say that words like identity, subjectivity, okay, appropriation, reappropriation, discourse, power, these are some of the terms, subaltern, liminality, these are the some of the important terms and important issues that are discussed, mostly issues of identity in so-called post-colonial nation states, right. These are some of the more contemporary issues being discussed, right. And finally, if you get a question like how do we critique post-colonialism? Post-colonialism critiques Western knowledge formation about the East, right, about the erstwhile colonies. How do we, what are the criticisms to which post-colonialism itself may be? What are the dangers of doing post-colonialism in a so-called narrow way, sort of way? Then the answer would be this. Some of the answers are, they go like this. For instance, post-colonialism of the Saidian kind, as we find in Orientalism, has been guilty of a sort of one-dimensional way of looking. The traffic is one-dimensional. The West has created the East. Do you follow? Okay. So these are some of the dangers. Some have also seen, people who are critics who are against postmodernism have also seen post-colonialism of a more discursive kind losing, out on many other, urgent issues, local issues, by talking about globalization, by talking about neo-colonialism, by talking about the colonial enterprise. Are we also not sort of not looking at or giving importance to what happens within a nation? So, the self-other binary of colonizer or say of colonizer-colonized is so huge in this discourse that it sort of seems to do away or sort of neglect questions of what happens even within the colonizing setup. Do you understand? Some of the more important questions have been raised by feminists, for instance, okay, regarding the black woman and the difference between the black woman, the political power differences between the black woman and the black man, right. So, these are other binaries that also get formed, but if we are in the larger discourse of the all important binary of colonizer-colonized, and these are some of the issues that get sidelined, right. So, again as I said, I have not taken up any book, any work at length. I've tried here to simply tell you what post-colonialism is, what its orientation is, what its goals are, okay, and post-colonialist criticism, literary criticism, okay, would obviously look for the text both from the colonizer and the colonized worlds, cultures, and look at how through Saidian lens how the West has created the East, and from other perspectives, for instance from Homi Bhabha's perspective, okay, the hybrid, the mixed, the nuances of hybridity of people who straddle two cultures, okay, even in a sort of temporarily post-colonial, post-independence situation. Okay. So, there is a lot of course to be learnt here, a lot of course to be, you can look at the Empire Writes Back, you can also look at Orientalism and look at some of the new books that have come up, right. Thank you so much, and we shall meet again in the next lecture.